Suffering from a mono-narrative in our discourse, whether it's about the environment, about the pandemic, or what's happening in Ukraine. Joseph says, great introduction, Mark. I agree with every word you've uttered tonight. That was so right, what you said about COVID mismanagement. We need to understand the other points of view to exit this unnecessary, tragic loss of lives. He's speaking there about the pandemic. Alan says, hi, Mark. Sean Bailey is spot on. Dialogue needed. China would be willing to broker. End of the day, money talked, says Alan. How about this? Leslie, good evening. Cannot believe I'm hearing this wonderful words from Mark Dolan. These are the greatest words I've heard from broadcast media in my lifetime. That's very kind and I'm sure not true, but thank you, Leslie. At last, someone who's willing to speak frankly and honestly about the mania infecting our thinking and calling for balanced and nuanced debates. And finally, Phil, who says, how's the phone? Phil, it's in one piece, unlike me. It's time now for The Clash. Those cases are worth the money. Yes, in The Clash, we tackle a major news story of the day from opposing points of view. It's been reported in the course of the pandemic that pressure from teaching unions was a major factor in school closures and ongoing mask mandates for kids as young as 11 in the classroom. Unions have pushed for work from home orders and myriad other COVID measures on behalf of their members, in some cases where the scientific case was debatable. Meanwhile, students who have been through hell with lectures on Zoom had to deal with the university strike last month, and now London is in chaos as tube workers down tools over pay and conditions. Public outrage around these strikes is growing, with GB News presenter Isabel Oakeshott pointing out the following. She tweeted, the average tube driver earns £56,000 for a 36-hour week plus bonuses, and they get 43 days annual leave. No wonder they leave. Today, they're bringing misery to millions of Londoners by going on strike to demand an even better deal. Change the law and fire the lot of them. So, are trade unions important representative bodies protecting the rights, pay and conditions of their members, or are they a divisive threat to businesses and the wider economy? Quite simply, here's the question. Are the unions destroying Britain? Send me your thoughts, mark at gbnews.uk, or tweet me at gbnews on Twitter, and I'll bring you the poll results shortly. But to debate this, I'm delighted to welcome former London Mayor Ken Livingstone and Robert Oulds, director of the Bruges Group, which is a group dedicated to the memory and political philosophy of Margaret Thatcher. Robert Oulds, are the unions destroying Britain?
Absolutely. The unions have absolutely also undermined workers' rights. They have actually damaged the interest of working people in this country. They've supported the European Union, they've supported mass immigration, supported climate change policies which have ramped up our energy costs. They supported the lockdowns, as you mentioned, which destroyed so many jobs. The unions, the established trade unions, are indeed woke. They're part of the establishment, and they're not really anymore about defending workers' rights. In fact, there's only been one union in this country that's actually been defending those who have been threatened with dismissal for not being vaccinated or for objecting to the lockdown. And there's that one union is the Workers of England Union and the Workers of Scotland Union. And they're the only unions that have actually been fighting for people's rights, whereas the establishment unions have just been going along with whatever government policy has been emerging, and they actually supporting policies that have harmed the least well-off in our society.
Ken Livingstone?
I completely disagree with that. All my life, trade unions have defended the rights of ordinary people, fought to get decent wage increase each year. As soon as I started work, I joined a trade union, and I'm still in the T&G union. I mean, literally, I think trade unions have done more than any political party to actually improve the quality of life for the mass majority of our population.
Except with inflation out of control now, Ken, surely the last thing we need is a lot of pay rises in the public sector. I mean, what is it about £50,000 a year for a 36-hour week that tube drivers don't like?
Yeah, but there aren't many workers earning that sort of money. The simple fact is that this level of inflation means that most people are seeing their real income go down year by year. And we've got to tackle inflation.
Yes, but if you have pay rises in the public sector, that pushes inflation up, Ken.
Yeah, no, it doesn't put inflation up.
Of course it does. That's what pay rises do. Pay rises are inflationary.
Literally, we need to actually ensure that people that work in the public sector and the private sector are getting a decent wage increase each year, which matches the level of inflation. And inflation is higher than the vast majority of wage
But Ken, that's
increases.
like quicksand. That's 70s economics. I mean, we'll be bankrupt, within a generation if we do that.
Yes, but we're not in the mess we're in today because of trade unions. We're in the mess we're in today because we've got appalling government.
Well, there's another point. Are we in the mess today because of the trade unions? Because it was reported widely that school closures were as a result of union pressure. And in fact, stay-at-home orders as well is something that trade unions were very firmly behind.
Our problem is that we have nothing like the level of investment in our economy that we used to have. And that's our problem. We need to see that private and public investment is matching the changes we need to see to keep our economy equal to major competitors like France and Germany.
But Ken,
we're badly behind them.
It's not investment, is it? It's borrowed billions.
No, it's you borrow money to invest, the economy grows, and you generate wealth, you can pay back the debt.
What about investing in our own
Robert,
people, Ken? We
me out.
have the trade unions that support almost unlimited immigration into the UK, the supported European Union membership, which brought more immigration in, and that lowered the wages for the least well-off. It added more demands onto our public services. It meant our young people would emerge from school or university and wouldn't necessarily be able to find a good job because there's a massive pool of people that a company could draw from. Indeed, they could just find an app, indeed, and get a load of workers in at a lower rate than what would otherwise be expected to pay. The mass immigration harmed the interests of the least well-off, and the unions supported it because they're part of the establishment. The unions may well have had a good role to play in the past with collective bargaining, with making sure that workers got a better deal, but those times have changed. They have gone, and we need to move on with that. There is a role for some unions that will actually stand up for workers' rights where they exist. But the established trade unions that just support the line from the government, that support the European Union, support mass immigration, support these climate change policies, and worst of all, supported the lockdowns, closing schools and even universities being closed, damaging the life chances of our young people. A lot of that came from pressure from the trade unions that are more about their woke ideology rather than actually fighting for their individual members' rights.
Well, yes, Ken, the teaching unions seem to care mainly about the welfare of their teachers, not the children. Will you accept now that it was morally wrong and also intellectually stupid to close schools in the first place during this pandemic?
I think it was, actually. But let's look at the reality. I mean, when the post-war Labour government encouraged people to come to Britain as immigrants from the Caribbean, it was because we didn't have enough people here to fill up all the jobs. I remember, literally there weren't enough bus conductors, and therefore people came in from Jamaica, they filled up those jobs. And it's also the same in many other areas. We haven't got enough doctors and nurses. That's what drives immigration.
We have too much pressure on our social services because there's so much immigration. The system just cannot cope. What we need to do, we have pressure on housing. What's driving up housing costs in this country? It's about supply and demand. Now, we need to defend workers' rights. Absolutely. There's a whole host of laws which should be applied and applied properly to give people a fair say at their work and make sure they're not harassed or discriminated against. But the established unions haven't been doing that. As I mentioned, the only union, as far as I know, that's defended people who faced the sack for not being jabbed or for criticising the lockdown was the Workers of England union. Other unions absolutely did not want to know when it came to care workers losing their jobs or the NHS nearly crippled by the government that was insisting that they be vaccinated. 73,000 doctors and nurses and other NHS workers could have left. It was only the Workers of England union, from what I know, that was actually defending those people who wanted to have their bodily autonomy and decide their own future rather than being told what to do by the government and the health secretary.
Well, I remember a different world from the one you're talking about, because all my life, unions have fought to improve the quality of life of people, all people, but to build more housing, create more jobs, improve education. Our trade unions have been a constant force for improving the quality of life.
Apart from when they wrecked the economy in the late 1970s, we had so many strikes in the winter of discontent that bodies weren't being buried, Ken. Margaret Thatcher was elected on a campaign slogan which was, "Who runs Britain? The unions or the government?" You must admit, at that point in their history, they were out of control. Margaret Thatcher cracked down on the unions, which is what led to 3 consecutive landslide wins.
Now, I don't agree with you. The simple fact is, when we got to 1974, Saudi Arabia quadrupled the price of oil and triggered a global recession. I mean, millions of people all over the world lost their jobs. That triggered strikes and things like that. But the unions were fighting to defend the quality of life for ordinary people. It was Saudi Arabia, not the trade unions, that caused that crisis.
Well, it didn't help when teachers were on strike to support the miners and the grave diggers were on strike. The dead couldn't be buried, rubbish couldn't be collected because there was rampant extremist trade unions with political agendas. And unfortunately, many of the largest trade unions have political agendas again. It's just the corporate political agenda that they now follow. Often they're just a tool for management. They're embedded in many councils, in many corporations, and they will just do as management says. They are part of the system now, and they're not actually fighting for workers' rights. They're fighting for their ideology. Before it was may have been a socialist or ideology and supporting Labour and supporting workers' rights where they could and making sure they got better pay. Now it seems they've sold out to the woke establishment.
Well, look, when I was the leader of the Greater London Council back in the 80s, and then when I was mayor at the beginning of this decade, I had no trouble negotiating with unions. You sit down...
That's because they were on your side. They were all your mates, Ken.
Yes, and I wanted to see their life improve.
You did the deal. You've done a lot of the deals with the RMT, which has inflated the costs of the London Underground to a massive level. And now the London Underground is possibly facing bankruptcy because they wouldn't work. We were locked down in London during the pandemic. And now that the extensions that are needed are not happening, they've bankrupted the system under Mayor Khan. It's a dreadful financial situation, and paying tube drivers more than airline pilots is just obscene.
Particularly, Ken.
Look, when I cut the fares on the bus and the tube, there was a massive increase in customers coming on. The number of people travelling on the bus went up 100%. And you've got to cut the fares, and that's not...
when your buses work.
But the problem is, Ken, it's the unions and the opposition, the government as well, admittedly, most of the media, who have been pushing for these ruinous lockdowns, which have cost the economy £500 billion. The money just isn't there, especially to pay tube drivers in excess of £56,000 a year for a 36-hour week. I mean, going back to that story, Ken, that strike, the tube strike, is not justified at the tail end of the biggest recession in 300 years.
We need to show that London and Britain has got back to working again and that we are open and ready for business. It's been terrible during these last 2 years. We're told it's just 2 weeks. It's been 2 years. And then just as we're coming out the pandemic, just as the government has announced there's going to be no more of these ridiculous rules that aren't needed, London Underground goes on strike, the city grinds to a halt. That sends out completely the wrong message. It's not what we need, and it's actually damaging the interest. They might be able to get a good pay rise for those who belong to the RMT, but every single worker in London that needed to get to work that day and had their day ruined, their interests are not being looked after.
The problem with our economy is not the trade unions, but government that hasn't done enough to get the investment we need to keep our economy growing strong.
OK, I mean, briefly, Robert, just to say in mitigation that if you had your way, you and your pals at the Bruges Group, Britain would be like Dickensian London, wouldn't it?
No, what we have some excellent laws that defend workers' rights, that defend people from harassment and discrimination and stop them being pushed around by management. What we have now is a growth of new trade unions that are that are growing and establishing themselves. This is something which is happening in America and in the United Kingdom as well. And as I mentioned, say, organisations such as the Workers of England Union, that went from being a small, relatively small union to taking on many, many thousands of workers because it was so active in keeping our NHS going and stopping the government ruining our
Robert,
health service by making sure everybody vaccinated.
If you had your way, there'd be no rights, 0 hours contracts, minimum wage. Life would be miserable for the working people of this country.
There would be rights, and it would be enforced not by unions which go on strike and ruin people's lives. It would be by unions fighting hard for their members and making sure they're not bullied and harassed. And what would be the best thing for workers and the best thing for young people who need to find a home and need to get a mortgage and get on the housing ladder would be to control immigration properly, and so we then invest in our young people and we give people a decent salary, because the worst thing that's happened to working people in this country, and it's absolutely proven, the numbers are in, is that the mass immigration has lowered wages for the least well off, but of course it's benefited the super rich and benefited the woke establishment who just love to undermine our national identity.
Except, Robert, that high immigration is linked to economic growth. But look, it's all about opinions. It's all about debate. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. London Mayor Ken Livingstone and Robert Oulds, director of the Bruges Group. A fascinating conversation. What do you think? Duncan on Twitter says the unions are always playing politics, be it education or transport, like with the London tube strikes. They couldn't care less about the damage caused. Elliot on Twitter says good unions have always represented their workers responsibly and well, thereby making life better all round. Bad unions use their strength irresponsibly, wreaking havoc and destroying jobs. We need the good. We can do without the bad. And Trevor on email. Trevor, thanks for your email. Unions were appropriate back in the days when we were sending young children up the chimneys. Today they are redundant and have evolved. They have evolved into a mafia. And your verdict is now in. In our text poll, 90% of you, 90%, agree that the unions are damaging Britain. 10% disagree. But a really great debate. Thank you so much to Robert and Ken for that one.